The four will always be fantastic. The hope will always be incredible. The words you wove within the hearts of heroes are indelible.
Okay, but now you have pubic hair.
Hello, friend. Really good to see you once again.
The very first video that I posted on this channel was a response to Bill Maher's comments regarding Stan Lee. Since it was my first time making a video, some problems occurred. The editing was sloppy, I made more mistakes while speaking, and I was using my editing software for free, which resulted in a giant watermark on the video, which completely obstructed the view and defeated the purpose of me having any visual aids, even though I spent so much time drawing those stick figures and Anyway, since I now have some more experience with making videos, I figured that I would revisit what Bill Maher said about Stan Lee and do it again. Wait. Sorry, I almost forgot. Ta-da! What do you think? I figured if I was gonna remake an old video, I might as well do something different, so I bought a theater! I know, it's a bit pricey, but hey, I'm doing it for work. I could always write it off as a business expense. I mean, yeah, I don't make any money doing this, but I think it would still count. Wait, if I claim this as a business expense, does that mean I can only use it during work? Because I'd really like to watch movies here during my free time. What was I talking about? Oh, yeah.
Tonight's editorial is about Stan Lee, who, if you missed it, died in November. And a few days later, I posted a blog that was in no way an attack on Mr. Lee, but took the occasion of his death to...
I'm just gonna stop you right there. If you take the occasion of someone's death and use it as an opportunity to do almost anything, that in itself is disrespectful. Now, I'd say there are exceptions, such as if someone died of a disease and you use their death to raise awareness of that disease and how to prevent it, but that's not what you did. You took Stan Lee's death and you used it as an opportunity to mock his fans. So even if the blog you wrote were constantly praising Stan Lee himself, to say that you didn't attack him would only be true by technicality. Now, notice that I said if, because I want to look at what you actually did say about Mr. Lee. The guy who created Spider-Man and the Hulk has died, and America is in mourning. Deep, deep mourning for a man who inspired millions to, I don't know, watch a movie, I guess. So immediately, we're making fun of people just for mourning his death, and implying that he wasn't that important because he didn't do anything more than entertain millions of people. Someone on Reddit posted, "I'm so incredibly grateful I lived in a world that included Stan Lee. Personally, I'm grateful I lived in a world that included oxygen and trees. But to each his own." And now we're saying it's foolish to appreciate the things that Stan Lee did because he wasn't as important as oxygen. Don't worry, Bill. When you die, we'll all make sure to stick to the standard that you set. Although you might actually consider yourself to be more important than oxygen. Now, is this thing able to rewind? Oh, cool, it is.
But took the occasion of his death to express my dismay at people who think comic books are literature and superhero movies are great cinema.
Let's just start by pointing out that comic books are literature. By definition, literature is any written work. I feel like that's worth pointing out because you're trying to paint comic book fans as unintelligent and immature, and yet you fail to use basic terminology. Now, you seem to be defining literature as good writing, so in that case, if you take the occasion of a man's death and use it as an opportunity to express how upset you are with the fact that people think that man was a good writer, how is that not an attack?
No, I'm not firing any shots at Stan Lee. I'm just saying that his work is without value, and that anyone who likes it is probably a fucking man-baby. That's not me saying anything bad about Stan Lee. How could you possibly have confused that with me saying something bad about Stan Lee? You know what though, I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt here. I honestly do believe that he's dense enough to think that he's actually not saying anything bad about Stan Lee.
And as for whether or not superhero movies are great cinema, I don't know, are westerns great cinema? Are rom-coms great cinema? Are whodunits great cinema? Are you trying to tell me that a movie becomes better or worse just by virtue of being a certain genre?
And who in general are stuck in an everlasting childhood. Bragging that you're all about the Marvel Universe is like boasting that your mother still pins your mittens to your sleeves.
I 100% agree. Anyone who brags or bases their self-worth on what media they consume is an absolute child.
You can, if you want, like the exact same things you liked when you were 10.
Really? I can? Promise? Gee, thanks, Mr. Maher.
But if you do, you need to grow up. That was the point of my blog.
What? You can do it if you want to, but if you do, you need to stop doing it? That doesn't even make any sense. If you're gonna lecture us about good writing, you should really fire whoever wrote this line. Nah, who am I kidding? No one helped you write this garbage.
I'm not glad Stan Lee is dead. I'm sad you're alive.
I'm not happy he's dead. I just wish you were dead. That's completely different. Ha 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 ha.
And by the way, if someone says you're being childish and you react by throwing a tantrum, you're not Iron Man. You're Irony Man.
Okay, where do I begin? For one, people who read comic books and watch superhero movies do not believe they're superheroes. And I know a lot of people were very upset by what you said, but how many of them were throwing tantrums exactly? Most of the backlash you got was through the internet, so how do you even determine if it's a tantrum? Did they type in all caps? And I wouldn't say there's anything ironic about this at all. Superhero fans watch and read a lot of stories of people who use their powers to defend those who can't defend themselves. So it's actually kind of fitting that they would leap to the defense of someone who quite literally cannot defend himself.
Well, let me tell you, people were pissed about this post. I wasn't even aware that I had ruffled so many capes.
Once again, we do not believe that we are superheroes, and being upset with you is not at all something that's exclusive to Stan Lee's fans. I know people who have no interest in comic books or superhero movies, and when I tell them about what you did, their jaws drop at the notion that somebody can react that way to somebody else's death.
Until I saw that 40,000 Twitter followers unfollowed me like that.
Wait, is that the tantrum you were referring to? People aren't following you on social media anymore? That is the most mild way to react to something that I can think of.
To which I say, good riddance, follow Yogi Bear.
Hey, boo-boo. Yes, Yogi? I just got 40,000 new Twitter followers. Wow, Yogi, how'd you do that? Why, it's simple, boo-boo. All you have to do is not use somebody's death as an excuse to brag about how much better you are than everybody else. That seems like kind of the bare minimum that you would expect from somebody. You'd think so, boo-boo, but some people are just scummier than the average scum.
Director Kevin Smith accused me of taking a shot when no shots are fucking necessary.
Kevin Smith was right.
Except again, my shot wasn't at Stan Lee.
Except again, it was.
No, I'm not firing any shots at Stan Lee. I'm just saying that his work is without value, and that anyone who likes it is probably a fucking man baby. That's not me saying anything bad about Stan Lee.
It was at, grown men who still dress like kids.
So, a man died, you took the occasion of his death to express your dismay with the people who enjoyed the works of art that man created. Kevin Smith told you that was unnecessary, and so you made fun of his clothes. Is Kevin Smith the immature one in this situation?
One comment said that Stan Lee has inspired children to believe in something bigger than them. And then added, congrats, you're a cunt, on the same level that Ann Coulter is a cunt.
Well, it's clear that you're not reading the comment in its entirety, but just reading 2 excerpts from the comment. I tried to look for the full thing myself, and unfortunately I could not. But I'm willing to guess that this guy gave reasons as to why.
You're a cunt.
And you just skipped to the part where he said a meanie word because it helps prove that we're all just throwing a giant tantrum.
Boy, did you pick the wrong night to tune in.
When it comes to your show, every night is the wrong night to tune in.
Other people tweeted things like, I learned about social justice and racial tolerance by reading comic books.
And in your mind, were those people also throwing tantrums?
Okay, but now you have pubic hair.
Well, as we established earlier, you began your blog post by implying that Stan Lee hasn't inspired people to do anything more than watch a movie. And you end your post by saying that comic book fans are the reason Donald Trump got elected. So when these people say that they learned about racial tolerance from comic books, they are disproving your first claim, and since they use the term social justice, we can infer that they're on the left politically, which disproves your second claim. But instead of addressing that, you're just gonna say, yeah, well, you're too old to read comic books now, so stop.
Read James Baldwin. Read Toni Morrison. Read Michael Eric Dyson.
I would like to know how many of the people applauding actually read anything by these three authors, because I'm guessing there was one or two people who got super excited that you validated their maturity and sophistication, and everyone else just went along with it because they don't want to seem dumb for not clapping. Obviously, I have no way to prove it, but I'm getting a real Emperor's New Clothes vibe from this.
Even a book as dumb as the Bible gets this.
I don't know how compelling you expect this argument to be if you're going to preemptively call your own source dumb.
When I was a child, I spoke as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things, including my X-Men bedsheets.
Well, the Bible quote you're using is from Corinthians 13. I will not read the full thing, but I will leave it on the screen if you want to read it for yourself. The message of the verse is that it's foolish to prioritize anything over love because love is the only thing that isn't impermanent. I'm not an expert when it comes to biblical interpretations, but it seems to me that childish things refers to pursuing anything that isn't love. And knowledge is actually explicitly listed as something that's inferior to love. So according to Corinthians, reading James Baldwin and Toni Morrison would be every bit as childish as owning X-Men bedsheets. But you know what? Why bother examining the Bible quote that you provided when I can just provide one of my own? At that time the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" He called a little child to him and placed the child among them. And he said, "Truly, I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." Now, this is the part where you tell us that it doesn't matter what the Bible says because the Bible's dumb. But you're the one who brought the Bible into this. And by the way, I spoke as a child.
But now you have pubic hair.
I understood as a child.
You can, if you want, like the exact same things you liked when you were 10. But if you do, you need to grow up.
And I thought as a child.
I honestly do believe that he's dense enough to think that he's actually not saying anything bad about Stan Lee.
Can we stop pretending that the writing in comic books is so good?
Well, point to a comic book and we can talk about whether that comic book was well written. The quality of a story's writing is not at all affected by the medium used to tell the story. Plays written by Shakespeare have been adapted into comic book format. But so long as the adapters don't change the writing, they are not making the writing any worse. I realize that was a tautological statement, but apparently it's something Bill needs to have explained to him. And by the way, Bill, Stan Lee was a comic book writer! Up until now, you've been arguing that comic books are for kids, which, while an insult to comic book readers, I suppose technically isn't an insult to comic book writers. But when you try to argue that the stories Stan Lee wrote aren't good writing, that is an attack on Stan Lee.
And then I try to tell you things, but you're too stubborn to understand!
And it is worth clarifying that saying something's meant for kids is completely different from saying it's bad writing. You can have something well written that's meant for kids, and you can have something horribly written that's meant for adults.
Oh, please. Every superhero movie's the same thing.
Wait, why are we talking about superhero movies? You mentioned comic books. Those are not interchangeable terms.
A person who doesn't have powers gets them.
Well, first of all, not every superhero movie has that. There is such a thing as sequels. But even if every superhero movie did have this, what would be the problem? If something happens in a story that isn't possible in real life, the writers should explain to the audience why this thing is happening. You're making the point that this is cliché and thus bad writing, but what should they do instead? Should the hero just casually mention how he got his powers in conversation? Or should we just say, screw it, he has powers because he has powers, no explanation necessary? And also, you're completely ignoring the fact that the actual getting of the powers is different for every superhero. Superhero gets powers is not just a scene stamped onto a script. It's something the writer has to come up with in order to explain the abilities of the heroes in a way that, even if not scientifically possible, is at least plausible. Captain America, subject of a government experiment to enhance his physical abilities during World War II. Good. Spider-Man, bitten by a spider that was filled with radioactive energy. A little out there, but I can get behind it. Captain Marvel, a ship exploded next to her. No.
A person who doesn't have powers gets them, has to figure out how they work.
Once again, the very existence of sequels means this doesn't happen in every superhero movie, and once again, even if we ignore that, how would this be a problem? If a character gets a new supernatural ability or weapon, of course they're gonna have to figure out how it works. This is not a cliche, it's just natural story progression. If we're gonna use something as broad as someone figures out how to do something as proof that all superhero movies are the same thing, then all movies are the same thing.
And that has to find a glowy thing. Justice League, glowy thing. Iron Man, glowy thing. Spider-Man, glowy thing. Captain America, glowy thing. Glowy thing, glowy thing, glowy thing.
Well, first of all, if this is something that every superhero movie has, what was the glowing thing in Winter Soldier, Civil War, Incredible Hulk, the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies, any Batman movie? And second of all, the glowy things are not the result of writing, it's the result of production. The writers put an item into their story that's either magical or technologically advanced, and the producers decide that the best way to show that this item is important is to make it glow. Glowy thing, glowy thing, glowy thing! When you argue that all the items you just showed are fundamentally no different because they're all shiny, do you honestly think you're making the superhero fans look dumb?
I spoke as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child.
You sure did, Bill. And by the way, you use the Space Stone, the Time Stone, and the Power Stone on your list of glowy things. These are 3 of the 6 Infinity Stones. They each represent a core element of the universe and are intrinsically linked to each other in the story, so it's actually good for the story that they're aesthetically similar. And the Time Stone wasn't something Doctor Strange had to find, it was something he did find while studying magic. So even with the incredibly broad criteria that you set up, you still got it wrong.
And again, there's nothing wrong with a man writing comic books. There is something wrong with adults thinking they're profound.
Again, comic book is not a synonym for superhero movie. Even if I were super generous and granted you that no superhero movie has any originality to it,
In no way an attack on Mr. Lee.
it would say nothing about the writing quality of comic books. And even if I were super duper generous and said that every comic book out there was horribly written,
In no way an attack on Mr. Lee.
to say that there's nothing wrong with creating something that's horribly written, but there is something wrong with enjoying something that's horribly written is just backwards. You can't control what you like, but you can control what you make. I realize this sounds hypocritical since I made a big point of showing that you did attack Stan Lee, but the problem I have is not with you criticizing him. It's that A, you lied about it, and B, you specifically waited until after he died. Which either means that you didn't have the guts to say this when Stan Lee was alive and could respond to you himself, or that you don't actually believe any of this and are just trying to make someone else's death about you. And do you not think that Stan Lee found his own work to be profound? That he maybe had an emotional attachment to the characters he created and was constantly redrafting because he wanted the stories to be the absolute best they could be? Or do you think that he just cynically pumped out story after story without caring about the quality at all because hey, it's just a bunch of kids reading them, why does it matter if the story's any good? Maybe the answer's somewhere in the middle of those two extremes, but my point is that I would prefer the former, and based on what you just said, you would prefer the latter.
The folks at Stan's company, Team Stan, wrote an open letter to me and said, "You have a right to your opinion that comics are childish and unsophisticated. Many said the same about Dickens, Steinbeck, Melville, and even Shakespeare."
Yeah.
No, they didn't.
Oh, so none of these authors had to deal with any type of generation gap or culture clash? They just wrote their stories and were instantly recognized as genius? You know, that quote from Corinthians is just becoming more and more appropriate.
I spoke as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child.
Like, you realize that Shakespeare's plays had fairies and witches and potions? If you existed during his time, you would be the one calling his stories childish.
No, no one ever said that. No one ever said King Lear or Moby Dick was childish and unsophisticated. If you ever read a book without pictures, you'd know that.
You know what, Bill? I don't feel like responding to this. Could you do it for me?
Someone says you're being childish and you react by throwing a tantrum. You're not Iron Man. You're Irony Man.
Thanks, Bill. What's going on? Why isn't the video playing? What do you mean, not a sufficient response? I used Bill Maher's own words against him. What could be better than that? Well, yeah, obviously I could say more, but like I said, I don't feel like it. No, this video's long enough as it is. For every minute Bill spoke, I spoke for 4 minutes. We need to speed things up. What? No, you can't do that to me. I love that theater. Fine. Bill, you said earlier that there's nothing wrong with writing comic books, and yet now you're implying that reading comic books makes you dumb. So either you believe there is something wrong with writing comic books, which would make you a liar, or you believe there's nothing wrong with creating something that damages people's intelligence. Which is it? Also, I feel the need to remind you that you are currently speaking to a company co-founded by Stan Lee. Aside from speaking to his family members, this is pretty much the closest you'll get to talking to Stan Lee himself. You insist that you're not firing shots at Stan Lee, and yet here you are firing shots at the people trying to represent and defend him. Also, you seem to think that reading comic books means you don't read anything but comic books. I have no idea where you got that idea from. Also, you're saying that a story becomes less profound if it's told using visual aids, and yet you're forgetting that Shakespeare wrote plays, which are every bit as dependent on a visual aid as comic books, if not more so. And also...
You're a cunt.
This guy's really making me uncomfortable now. Tell me about it. Is his audience willing to soak up any piece of hot garbage he spits out? I'm genuinely afraid of how they'll react if they find out I haven't read anything by James Baldwin. Listen, just smile and laugh along. It's almost over and we don't want to make them upset.
Team Shakespeare should write you an open letter.
Why? They're not saying that Shakespeare's plays are childish, they're saying Shakespeare's plays have been called childish. Even if they're wrong, that's not particularly insulting.
Yes, Howard the Duck, Hamlet, same diff.
For one, Team Stan did not claim that Stan Lee was on the same level as Shakespeare, just that they both received similar criticism. If you're gonna lecture us on what we should or shouldn't read, you should at least learn how to read. And why are you using Howard the Duck? He's a character created by Marvel specifically to satirize the rest of Marvel. He's basically the original Deadpool.
I do damage when I brandish my katanas, man. I'll slice you up and vanish in my ladybug pajamas.
I know that I said that genre is not an indicator of writing quality, but we're not talking about how well written these stories are. We're talking about how childish they are. And a tragedy is just by default less childish than a comedy. If we were to be fair, we would compare Howard the Duck to Midsummer Night's Dream and Hamlet to Old Man Logan. And I think even you realize that if you said Wolverine, Hamlet, same diff, not even your own audience would find it as ridiculous as you're making it out to be.
To thine own self be true, meet Hulk smash.
So are you saying that if a character in a story is childish and unsophisticated, that makes the story itself childish and unsophisticated? Because if so, there's a book out there called Of Mice and Men that I highly recommend you read. Earlier you scoffed at the idea that John Steinbeck's work was called childish and unsophisticated, and yet here you are setting a standard that would result in John Steinbeck's work being called childish and unsophisticated.
Comics are for kids. That's why they sell them next to the Pokemon card.
Bill, this is how you spell Pokemon. P-O-K-E-M-O-N. I realize you're mispronouncing it intentionally to get under the skins of Pokemon fans, but you could have pronounced it Pokemon or Pokemon and the joke still would have worked. When you read the letters M-O-N and pronounce it man, it doesn't make you sound like someone who doesn't care about Pokemon, it makes you sound like someone who's illiterate.
Comics are for kids. That's why they sell them next to the Pokemon cards and not on the aisle with the condoms and the lube.
Like I said, I've already responded to this monologue, and up until now I've either been addressing points I haven't already addressed, or taking points I have made and expanding on them. But this time I'm just gonna play footage from how I responded in my first video, because I really don't have much to add. I can't buy this thing I like. It's next to another thing that's for kids. Cocoa Puffs, sure, they taste delicious, but it's got a cartoon bird on it. That's for kids. TV dinner? It's sold next to the ice cream. Ice cream's for kids. Real Time with Bill Maher? That's on HBO. You know what else is on HBO? Sesame Street. Kids! I am not a kid! I'm a big boy and I buy condoms!
Sorry,
Yeah, I know. The audio's awful and out of sync. That's why I'm making this video. Jeez.
I'm sorry, but if you're an adult playing with superhero dolls, I'm sorry, I mean collectible action figures.
Well, very few adults actually play with action figures. You even say yourself there.
Collectible.
And taking a
Collectible.
action figure out of its box makes it lose its value as something that's
Collectible.
But I'm just gonna let that go, because what I really want to know is if there's an adult who does enjoy playing with action figures or dolls or whatever you want to call it, what's the problem?
Why not go all the way and drive to work on a big wheel?
So it's a problem because it's weird? That's the only argument I can get from this. So first of all, your comparison already fails because if you're driving a big wheel to work, it's not just a source of enjoyment, it's serving a practical purpose, and it's just more pragmatic to use a car or even a regular bike. So forgive me, but I'm gonna have to modify your question so that it better fits the point you're trying to make. Why not go all the way and ride around on a big wheel? Well, because I don't want to. There is no contradiction with doing one thing that's considered childish and not doing another thing that's also considered childish. I don't owe you any type of criteria or logical consistency when it comes to the things I do and don't enjoy. If anything, it's on you to tell us why not, because you're the one saying this is for kids and it's wrong for an adult to be entertained by it.
Grown-ups these days, they cling so desperately to their childhood that when they do attempt to act their age, they have a special word for it now. Adulting.
Bill, there's such a thing as self-depreciation. Basically, people like you enjoy telling jokes, and unlike you, decide that instead of trying to ostracize someone based on their hobbies or belittle someone for mourning a man's death, they would rather poke fun at themselves and be the butt of their own joke. When someone uses the word adulting, they're not bragging about how mature they are or complaining about how difficult their life is. They're making fun of themselves for being childish.
Hey world, look at me. I just made my own eye appointment. Hashtag adulting. Eating vegetables, adulting.
I read James Baldwin and Toni Morrison. Adulting.
Today I wiped my own ass.
Which one? The one above your legs or the one above your neck?
I guess I'm turning into my dad. Marriages have been destroyed.
Hey Bill, how's the missus? I mean, I'm just assuming you're married because certainly a man in his 60s who's never been married would never lecture someone else about marriage, right? Right? Anyway, I looked up the 4 articles that you have on screen, and they consistently address video game addiction. Gaming addiction is a genuine problem, and it can put your relationships at risk if you're afflicted with it. Just like any other addiction. People should moderate the time they spend on video games to avoid addiction. People who are already addicted should get mental help, and we may even need some regulations on gaming companies to make the games less addictive. Now, the first 2 are easier said than done, and the third is its own can of worms since it makes this a political issue, but they are still much better solutions than what Bill has to offer, which is adults should stop playing video games. Just adults. Because remember, the whole point of this monologue is that adults shouldn't do things that are meant for kids.
You can, if you want, like the exact same things you liked when you were 10. But if you do, you need to grow up.
So, after supposedly reading about how psychologically harmful video games can be, Bill comes to the conclusion that they're fine for kids, but not for adults. Which is the most backwards thing I can think of.
Because the husbands, adult men, can't stop playing video games.
Yep, just like I said, it's a problem that adults are addicted to video games. And it doesn't even cross your mind that if adults are at risk of video game addiction, that children must be even more susceptible. I am not trying to paint video games as the boogeyman. It is fine to play them and addiction is rare. But for Bill to use the fact that video games can be addictive to support the conclusion that only young people should be playing them is undescribably stupid.
When your wife wants to have sex and you can't come to bed because you're about to level up in Fortnite, don't be surprised when your relationship does this.
You are talking about people with an addiction, Bill. I realize that to you, it's super silly that the thing they're addicted to is a video game, but that doesn't change anything. Take what you said and replace leveling up in Fortnite with drinking or gambling, and you sound like an absolute sociopath. Thank God we're done. I really don't know how to end this video. Last time I closed out by saying I no longer care what Bill Maher has to say, but clearly that isn't true since I felt the need to make a second video that's over twice as long as the first one. So here's what I'm gonna do. I was reading through the comments of Bill Maher's blog post and I found one that I particularly like, so I'm just gonna wrap things up by reading it here. What irked me about Bill's response to the backlash is that he backpedaled when he finally addressed it back in January on Real Time. Sure, he doubled down on his criticism of comic books, but he wasn't man enough to admit that he took a very obvious shot at Stan Lee's legacy. He was cute trying to suggest this was nothing more than a criticism of adult comic book fans. The vehicle for that criticism just happened to be Stan Lee's death, and he just happened to make an asinine comment about Stan Lee's legacy in the first paragraph. Coincidence. I don't agree with Bill's comments, but they don't particularly bother me either. I also don't think that just because someone dies, they are immediately sanctified and insulated from any and all critique. So, by all means, Bill was free to take a shot. But if you're going to do it, don't hide from the issue for 2 months, and then when you finally do speak out, don't deny that you did it. Maher is constantly raving about liberals being weak, and he often has a valid point, but this is nothing but weakness. He didn't even have to double down on taking a shot at Stan Lee. He could have acknowledged that despite what his personal views on comic books are, the way he went about expressing those views was insensitive. Either response would have been fine by me because at least you're having an open and honest dialogue, but trying to weasel your way out of it while still affecting this intellectual tough guy persona was just sad. Bill, it's easy to reiterate your critique of a man who will undoubtedly leave a far greater and lasting impact on this world than any of us, yourself included. But it's not so easy to take ownership of that criticism and its insensitive and hurtful consequences, regardless of whether those consequences were intended. The latter is being an adult.
Enough said.